So when it comes to delay completion, a lot of people tend to compare it to potentially option agreements and kind of how they're structured. So there's a very, very clear difference between delay completion and option agreements. The first one being an option agreement is your ability to go into that deal or come out of that deal as you see fit as the purchaser. So it gives you the freedom to be able to go in, go get planning. If you then decide you don't want the deal, you can pull out with no repercussions. So the option agreement very much puts you in control as the purchaser. When it comes to an exchange with delay completion, and that might be an exchange subject to planning, it might be a delay subject to doing a refurb, whatever it may be, or it may just be that you want a bit of time between exchange and completion, the vendor is always in control. So an exchange firmly puts the vendor in control. They are the one who decides when completion takes place. They are the one that serves notice on you. So when it comes to exchanging subject to planning, if you took an option agreement, for example, you would go and get the planning. You would then decide, okay, well, I've got planning permission. I've still got 3 months left on my option agreement. I'm going to go and tick off all of my pre-commencements. When it comes to the exchange, depending on what you've decided with the vendor, for example, if it is just literally subject to planning, the moment that decision notice comes through, the vendor will serve notice on you. That means you then have 10 days to complete. The issue you've got there is that isn't long enough to clear your pre-commencements. It isn't long enough to negotiate your section 106. It isn't long enough to do anything that you need to do. So 10 days puts you under immense pressure, and it isn't long enough for you to then go and get your development finance, etc. So that is the clear difference between delay completion and option agreement. Option agreement puts the purchaser in control. Exchange with delay completion puts the vendor in control and puts the purchaser at risk potentially. So when it comes to negotiating the exchange, there's a clear sort of route you have to take. It's slightly easier to negotiate because the moment that you negotiate an exchange, you are agreeing to complete on that purchase. You are saying, right, we're going to exchange and complete. The exchange gives the vendor some certainty that you're moving ahead. So they're much easier to negotiate than some of the other strategies that we've spoken about. However, what you need to be really firm on is what is the exchange subject to? Is it subject to planning? If it's subject to planning, is it subject to getting the decision notice? Is it subject to getting the pre-commencements ticked off? Is it subject to getting the section 106 signed off? Is it subject to getting your development finance through? There's all of these clauses that you need to ensure are correct. And that ties in nicely with the legal process in that you need to make sure you've got a good solicitor who looks after your interests and make sure that you're protected from every aspect of the exchange, to make sure that you know exactly when you're due to complete. And they need to make sure that you're in a position where you actually can complete and where you can actually draw down your development finance or your bridging finance or your mortgage or whatever you've decided to go for. Because if you can't do that and then you get served with your 10-day notice, it becomes very, very difficult and you could leave yourself in a position to be sued. So negotiating it's a very, very dangerous strategy for the purchaser because it can leave you in a lot of trouble. So that's where getting a good solicitor in place, going through very, very clear negotiations and setting very clear timescales and very clear sort of goalposts of when you're going to complete is massively important. And bring your broker in as well. Talk to your broker, find out when the development finance is available to be drawn down, because you need to make sure if you go and negotiate your exchange subject to your section 106, for example, but not your pre-commencements, you might go to your development finance lender and they might say, well, actually, we need all of the pre-commencements ticked off before we can lend you the development finance, at which point you're then in a position where you've been served your notice, you haven't done your pre-commencements, you can't draw down on your development finance, you've then got to rush around trying to find investors and everything else. So the negotiations need to be very, very clear, and you need to bring everyone to the table to make sure that you set out a timeline that is achievable, but also protects you more than anyone else. So when it comes to financing an exchange with delayed completion, there's one strategy which kind of sort of trumps everything else, which is where you do an exchange with a delayed completion for maybe 3 months, 4 months, whatever it may be, and actually go in and do a refurb whilst you're on that exchange. So obviously you need to negotiate that with the vendor, make sure they're happy with it, make sure they're happy for you to go and do the works. But if you can negotiate an exchange with delayed completion whereby you go in and do the refurb, you can actually, in theory, raise the value of the property and then use bridging finance to then bridge against the increased value as opposed to the purchase price. So it may be that you say, well, look, we're exchanging at 150, you go in and do a 25 grand refurb, for example, and it's maybe then worth 150 or 225, whatever it may be. And you then bridge your 75% of that 225, which in theory should be enough to cover that purchase price and potentially also get some of the refurb back out as well. So it massively decreases the amount of deposit you need to put into the deal and actually saves you having to go out and find maybe as many investors. If you do an exchange subject to planning, for example, what you also do is what we mentioned when we were speaking about option agreements, which is where you actually create equity by getting planning and taking the property from being worth X to being worth Y, hopefully a substantial increase by going and getting that planning permission. And again, same as option agreements, that increase in equity that you create is seen as your input into the deal, and development lenders will look at that as your input into the deal. And in theory, again, it will stop you having to go out and find big chunks of investment and having to put in large deposits. So both of those strategies can be ways of reducing deposits and are both really good ways of financing exchanges with delayed completion. So summary of the pros of exchanging with delayed completion. So the biggest one, and pretty much one of the, well actually there's two that you want to focus on. The biggest one is the ability to reduce deposits. Obviously it's a massive thing across the board, and it's that ability to take a property from being worth X to Y and doing it in that time period where you actually don't have ownership of the property and generating your own deposits through a property that you don't actually own as of that point. So that's the biggest one to begin with, is that ability to sort of put in less money. The second one is that it's easier to negotiate than other property strategies that are out there, because the exchange normally is the point where the vendor is like, right, okay, we've exchanged, I'm happy, I'm protected, I know that the property is sold, I know that it's going to go through, subject to anything massive going wrong. But it really, there's no reason why they shouldn't go with an exchange with delayed completion unless they're absolutely desperate for the money. Maybe if it's a distressed vendor or an auction purchase or something like that, obviously they're not going to go for that. But normally, 9 times out of 10, you can probably negotiate an exchange with some form of delayed completion with minimal issues involved. So without a shadow of a doubt, one of the easier strategies to negotiate and actually finance. So when it comes to the cons of an exchange with delayed completion, obviously the biggest one is that it protects the vendor more than it does the purchaser. It puts the purchaser in a very difficult position because they are at the mercy of the vendor the whole time. They're being served notice on and everything else. So from that perspective, the biggest con of all of this is actually you're not in control of the purchase, and actually you're at any one point could be served notice if your negotiations haven't gone to plan or if you haven't set out the right timescales and everything else, and it could put you in a very, very difficult financial position. So actually I would say an exchange with delayed completion is one of the most dangerous strategies. Yes, it's probably one of the best for negotiation in terms of its ease and in terms of the fact that you can reduce deposits, but actually it's probably one of the most dangerous in terms of ones that could backfire on you. So well worth keeping that in mind, and I would say getting a very, very good solicitor is worth its weight in gold when it comes to negotiating an exchange with delayed completion.